I had always wanted to go camping in the French countryside. There was something about the untouched woods, the quiet little towns, and the big open fields that felt so peaceful. After working nonstop for months, I decided to take a week off and finally do it. I picked a spot deep in the woods not far from a small village where there weren't many people around. It seemed like the perfect place to relax. The first 2 days were calm. The trees stood tall and still with just the sound of leaves moving. Every now and then at night it was cool but not freezing, and the stars above stretched across the sky. I had everything I needed, set up my tent, and made simple meals over the fire. There wasn't anyone around for miles, and I liked that. Felt like I had the whole forest to myself. But on the third night things started to feel different. As the sun went down I realized the usual calm was gone. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. Felt like the forest was waiting for something. I tried to ignore it, but it left me feeling uneasy, like something wasn't right. I made dinner like I usually did and got into my tent. Once the fire went out I wanted to sleep, but that feeling of something being wrong wouldn't go away. I lay in the dark listening to the silence, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from being so tired. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The tent was completely dark, and at first I didn't know why I was awake. Then I heard a sound I couldn't ignore. Footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps coming from just outside my tent. My heart was pounding, and I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. I didn't want to believe what I was hearing, but it was real. The footsteps got closer, circling around my tent. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but the way the steps sounded, they were too slow, too heavy, too much like a person. I grabbed my flashlight, trying not to make any noise, and turned it on. The light flashed through the tent, and for a second the steps stopped and everything went quiet again. But my mind was racing. What if someone was out there? What were they doing? I listened, hoping it would go away, but after a few moments the steps started again, this time moving away back into the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my heart racing every time I thought I heard something. But the footsteps didn't come back. When the sun finally started to rise, I cautiously stepped out of my tent. There were no signs that anyone had been there, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. But that feeling that someone had been watching me stuck around. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, deciding I'd had enough of the French woods. On the drive back to the village, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Someone or something had been out there walking around my camp. I kept trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. It didn't seem like something I could just brush off. A few days later, when I was back home, I did some digging online to see if I could find out more about the area. That's when I came across some old stories about people disappearing in that forest, hikers and campers who went into the woods and never came back. No one ever found their bodies, and the local police had stopped looking after a while. That was all I needed to know. I'll never go back to that place, not even close. It felt like the forest was hiding something dark that I was lucky to escape from. I still wonder what was out there that night circling my tent, but part of me thinks it was just a warning. Next time I might not be so lucky. I remember it like it just happened. In the summer of 1931, I made the choice to go camping by myself for a few nights in the woods outside a small town. I wanted to get away for a while. No noise, no people, just me in the quiet of the woods. I packed my old tent, some food, a lantern, and my knife. The spot I picked seemed perfect. There were tall trees everywhere and a small stream nearby. I set up my camp in a little clearing that felt safe. It was far enough from town that no one would bother me, but not too deep into the woods. Felt right. The first night was calm. I could hear the usual stuff, crickets, the stream flowing softly, and now and then a noise from a small animal in the bushes. The second night was different. I can't really describe why, but something seemed off. As the sun began to set, I noted how quiet the woods had gotten, with fewer noises, so I waited by the fire until it became dark, slid into my tent, and fell asleep without any difficulty. There were no crickets or shrubs moving. There was just silence. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just overthinking, but as I sat by the fire that night, the feeling of being alone started to change. I hadn't seen another person for miles, but it suddenly felt like I wasn't by myself. I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like I could sense eyes on me watching from somewhere in the trees. I stayed up longer than I wanted to, just listening. Nothing really happened, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Eventually, I forced myself to go into the tent, telling myself I was being paranoid. On the third day, I woke up early, planning to explore around a bit. I stuck to the trails I knew, staying close enough to my campsite so I wouldn't get lost. But on the way back, I noticed something strange. The path I had walked the day before looked different. There were broken branches, and the ground looked disturbed, like someone or something had come through there. First, I thought it was just an animal. But as I walked, I saw something that made me stop. In the dirt were footprints. Large ones. They were too big to be mine, and they weren't shaped like any animal prints I'd seen. A cold feeling hit me when I finally made it back to camp. My heart missed a beat. I couldn't sleep that night because every little noise outside the tent made me jump, and I could hear twigs snapping and soft footsteps just beyond the light of my fire. The fire I had put out the night before had been tampered with, as if someone had tried to stir it up, and some of my food was gone. I stood there for a minute trying to figure it out, but I hadn't seen or heard anyone around. It didn't make sense for someone to come all the way out here, touch my belongings, and then disappear without my knowledge. After hours of this, I finally peeked out of my tent and saw that the fire had burned down to just a few glowing embers, but there was still enough light to see the edge of the clearing, and there at the tree line, I saw someone standing there, perfectly still, watching me. I lay there with my knife, trying not to breathe too loudly, and I wanted to think I was just imagining it, but the noises wouldn't stop. I became cold. I hoped they hadn't seen me move, since I couldn't see much in the dark, but I could tell it was a tall person because they simply stood there and stared at me. Holding my knife, I waited all night for them to do anything, but they didn't. When the sun eventually rose, I peered out again, but they were vanished, as if they had never been there. I didn't waste time. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up my belongings and left as quickly as possible. I didn't eat. I didn't even check to see if I had left anything behind. I just needed to get away. I'm not sure who or what was in those woods, but I never returned to that location. Perhaps it was just a wanderer, or perhaps someone had been watching me since I set up camp. I'll never know, but occasionally, even now, I still get that icy, creeping feeling that someone is still out there, waiting for the right opportunity to approach. During a week-long survival exercise designed to test our capabilities, I was a member of a tiny army unit stationed at a secluded training camp deep in the woods. With just a few improvised tents and a little fire pit to keep us warm at night, our camp was encircled by dense vegetation and trees. The first few days were normal training drills, navigational tasks, and the usual camaraderie that comes with roughing it. But on the fourth night, something started to feel off. I was on night watch alone while the others slept. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Around midnight, I heard a faint noise like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon. I scanned the dark forest, but all I could see were shadows shifting in the moonlight light. I tried to shake off the unease and focus on my duty. The noise grew louder and closer. I gripped my flashlight tighter, trying to cut through the darkness with its beam. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and an eerie silence settled over the camp. My heart pounded. I knew something wasn't right. I moved cautiously towards the noise, trying to stay as quiet as I could. As I got closer to the edge of the camp, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure barely Visible was crouched behind a tree. It looked like a man, but I couldn't make out any details. Uncertain of whether to advance or retreat, I chose to back off gradually in the hopes of warning the others without making any abrupt movements. We quickly packed up our gear, keeping an eye out for any signs of danger. The unsettling feeling persisted as we hurried to dismantle our camp and load our gear. I turned my head briefly to check on the camp, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. I was about to exhale in relief when I noticed a pair of fresh boot prints in the dirt, large military-style prints that didn't match any of ours. We left that isolated eerie forest just before dawn, and when we returned to base, we discovered that a recent escape from a nearby maximum security prison had occurred. The escape description matched the person I had seen, and we had unintentionally run into a dangerous fugitive that night in the woods. We barely avoided a deadly encounter, and we had no idea how close we had come to a true nightmare. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, so my neighbor Tom and I decided to camp in the woods behind our houses. We set up our tents a few hundred feet apart in the hopes of escaping the daily grind, and as night fell, I built a fire and sat by it, enjoying the typical forest sounds. I noticed that Tom's tent was unusually quiet, which struck me as strange, but I didn't give it much thought. The idea that someone could have been lurking in the dark right outside our camp still makes me shiver. Around midnight, the typical cricket chirping and leaf rustling in the forest ceased, and an odd hush took its place. I assumed it was just the night and tried to unwind when I heard faint rustling sounds coming from Tom's tent. I thought he might be looking for something, so I picked up my flashlight and went over to see if he needed assistance. As I got closer, I called out softly, but no one answered, and the flashlight beam was moving strangely. When I got to Tom's tent, I noticed that it was unzipped and that the flashlight was still shining on the ground. The tent was empty, and my heart began to race as I looked around, feeling increasingly uneasy. The forest became extremely quiet once more. I heard slow, deliberate footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. My instinct told me to return to my tent and call for assistance, so I hurried back while trying to remain composed. I grabbed my phone, but it was dead. I kept my flashlight on and looked around anxiously for hours before the silence descended. Just before dawn, I heard a voice, not Tom's, calling for assistance from the woods. The voice was faint and frantic, and I followed it through the dense foliage until I ultimately located Tom, who was severely injured and confused after being assaulted and knocked unconscious. The worst part was when Tom talked about seeing dark figures moving around his tent before he was attacked. It felt like the woods themselves had turned against us. We never found out who did this or why the woods were no longer a safe place, but it was a chilling reminder that danger could be lurking in the darkest corners. Tom later claimed that he heard someone approaching his tent and grabbed the flashlight to check it out. When he stepped outside, someone hit him from behind. He never saw who it was, but his injuries made it clear that the attacker had left him for dead. I still get chills when I think about it, and I try to stay away from those woods whenever I can. My grandmother loved being outside, and she somehow convinced me to join her for the weekend. I wasn't particularly excited, but she always seemed so at ease, so I agreed. On the first day, we went for a walk, cooked dinner over a small fire, and watched the stars before going to bed. That night, for some reason, the woods were too quiet. There were no bugs or wind, and I lay there for a while, feeling uneasy. We spent the whole of the next day strolling about, but I couldn't shake the weird sensation that something was watching us every time I glanced at the trees. I attempted to sleep, telling myself it was only because we were so far from everything. My grandmother didn't seem to notice anything strange, so I didn't mention it. By the time the sun started going down, I was more than ready to go to sleep and just get through the night. While we sat by the fire that evening, I kept hearing odd noises coming from the woods. It wasn't animals, at least not any I could recognize. The sounds were low, like something big was moving through the bushes, but it never got close enough to see. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I didn't want to worry my grandmother, so I stayed quiet. After we put out the fire, we went back to the tent. It was even quieter than the night before. I lay there for what felt like forever, that uneasy feeling growing stronger. My grandmother was sound asleep next to me, totally unaware of how tense I was. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't far from the tent, maybe 20 feet or so, and they were slow and steady. I froze, not moving a muscle, listening closely. The steps circled the tent, not too close, but never too far. This wasn't just some animal wandering by. Whoever or whatever it was, they were taking their time. I stayed completely still, hardly breathing. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I hoped they had left, but then they started again, this time even closer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there could probably hear it. I had no idea what to do. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods, but I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't sleep after that. I lay awake listening to every little sound. We packed up to leave that morning, and although I didn't tell my grandmother about the noises, I couldn't wait to get out of there. As we hiked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone or something was watching us. Outside the tent, the night seemed to go on forever, but when the sun finally came up, I was relieved. The woods were too quiet once more, and I had the feeling that we weren't alone. Just before we reached the car, I noticed footprints by the tree line. They weren't animal tracks, but rather large, fresh human footprints, and they had been right next to our tent. I stared at the prints, feeling sick to my stomach, thinking that someone had been watching us while we slept. I looked back at the woods, but I couldn't see anyone. But I knew that they were still there, waiting. Perhaps they had followed us the entire time, or perhaps they had been seen marked, and perhaps they would return. I needed a rest. Being a police officer may be mentally taxing, so I thought spending a weekend camping by myself would help me decompress. I located a peaceful area deep in the woods, far from the din of traffic, and the continual crowd of people seemed like the ideal way to get away. Things felt different on the second night, even though I had set up my tent and started a fire, but something wasn't right. The forest wasn't as lively as it had been, and there were no animal sounds. On the first night, all I could hear were the sounds of the forest, leaves blowing in the wind, birds singing, and occasionally a branch snapping in the distance. No breeze, just this weird, oppressive quiet. I tried to ignore it, figuring that perhaps I was just overanalyzing things because of my job. After years of being a cop, you're always on guard and watching, so this silence felt excessive. But eventually I heard slow footsteps, as if the person or thing was trying to blend in. They were far away, but not so far that I couldn't tell if they were real or if I was just getting jittery, but it was enough to make me uneasy. Hours passed, and I decided to get some sleep. I crawled into my tent to try to calm myself down, but then I heard the footsteps again, this time much closer, and my heart began racing. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold night air. I felt this tightness in my chest as I pointed the light toward the trees again. Nothing but darkness. And then as I turned to go back to my tent, I saw them. I searched the area around my campsite, shining the light into the trees, but there was no movement and no sign of anyone. I returned to sitting by the fire, staring into the dark woods, and I kept waiting for the sound to return, but all I could hear was the crackling of the fire. I sat by the fire watching myself when I saw new footprints surrounding my campsite. My blood froze since I knew that these weren't mine. My heart was racing when it hit me hard, and I backed into my tent, grabbed my bag and flashlight, and started packing as quickly as I could because I wanted to leave. However, I heard those footsteps again, and this time they weren't coming from one direction. I could hear them everywhere. I listened for a while, trying to determine how near they were. Whoever was out there, they weren't just one of them. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my belongings and started walking down the trail with my flashlight shaking in my hand. I could hear them following me, not too closely, but close enough to confirm that I was being followed. I walked faster and then started running, and the footsteps followed me until I was just out of sight. I didn't look back until I got to my car, where I threw my gear in, jumped in the driver's seat, and sped down the dirt road before I pulled away. One last time, I glanced back and saw a few dark shapes standing at the edge of the trees, just where the light from my car reached. I continued driving until I arrived at the closest town, where I sat for a while to catch my breath. I considered reporting it, but I knew that no one would find anything because I've seen enough in my years on the force to know that sometimes the worst things aren't supernatural or from a fairy tale. Sometimes it's just people. What's scary is that those people out there knew the woods better than I did, and they weren't just watching me for fun. They were waiting to let me know that I wasn't alone, but I have no idea how many others didn't. I had been camping alone in the woods, far from anyone, for years, and I always enjoyed the silence at night. Usually, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. I was putting up my tent just before sunset when I realized how silent the woods were. No birds, no crickets. Nothing. I dismissed it at first, but as the night wore on, I began to find the stillness to be bothersome. The longer I sat there, the worse it got. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was out here alone, far from anyone, and there was no reason to feel uneasy, but I couldn't stop the growing fear that was creeping in. I started to feel like someone was watching me when I built a fire and sat by it eating dinner. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was only darkness outside the reach of the fire's light. I thought that after getting some sleep, I would feel better, so I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and laid down in an attempt to unwind. However, every small sound outside seemed louder, and suddenly every leaf cracking or twig breaking made my pulse beat. It didn't feel like animals, even though I kept telling myself that it was. I don't know how long I lay there listening to the night on the roof of my tent, but then I heard slow, heavy footsteps outside my tent. They stopped right next to me, and I froze, holding my breath, too afraid to move. There was only silence, and I could feel my heart thumping in my chest. I waited for something to happen, but nothing happened, and after what seemed like hours, the footsteps began to move away, slowly fading into the trees. I listened for a while without moving, but the footsteps didn't return. My heart was still pounding, so I packed up everything as quickly as I could, barely pausing to think, and drove off without turning around. I finally plucked up the courage to grab my flashlight and unzip the tent. I shone the light into the trees to see if there was any indication of what or who had been out there, but there was nothing, no tracks, no broken branches, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. I never found out what or who it was that night, but sometimes, when I'm alone myself in a peaceful setting, I can still hear those heavy, slow footsteps in my head. It makes me wonder if whatever it was didn't really leave that night, or if it's still waiting for me to return in the dark.